Okay, please be patient because this is our first Blackboard experience, so some small issues with technicalities may arise, but I will try to be helping you all to communicate. I'm reading the chat in Sala, in the room, in case anyone needs help or something. And then you can also raise your hand with the icons or put emoticons or whatever. Okay. So I will close the video now, okay? Is everyone able to see the presentation? Okay, so I'm not really moderating this webinar. You have very strong people to do it. You have Jonah, Mel, Nicole, and Helen in the room. And we'll just give you some advice for the use of Blackboard in case you haven't used it before. You see, wait. I'm trying to manage this. Are you seeing my hand? No. Yes, now you see my hand. So you need to check here if you're not listening well or you're not able to speak. But then every time you speak, you need to press talk and then unpress when you finish. And you can write here, I'm reading, and I don't think you will need, but you can also write on the whiteboard. One useful tip is that you may close all the things that you are doing, but it's not absolutely necessary. You can raise your hands as we were seeing in the icons part, can text anytime, okay? You can, Yona, Mel, and Nicole, and Helen have decided that it's better if you post questions as we go, so please do it. And I leave the floor to Jonah.
Thank you, Veronica. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Yona Nestel. I'm the Senior Education Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the Global Hub. I sit in the Policy and Advocacy team, which is part of the larger Global Influencing and Partnerships team at Global Hub. Just before we start, I'm going to have to excuse myself because it's early morning here in Canada and my two very young kids are screaming their heads off right now. So if you hear that in the background, I apologize. It's comforting to know that we do have ECD people here that understand the struggle of having small children while you're trying to work. So the first slide here is just the objectives of this webinar. We wanted to improve colleagues' understanding of the GPE, the Global Partnership for Education. It is a very important strategic partner for us on education and also on early childhood development. And it is important that colleagues understand how we're engaging with the GPE at both a global and a country level, which I'm actually looking forward to learning from many colleagues on the call, how you might be engaging with the GPE in your respective countries. The next objective is to really explain some of the new funding opportunities that are going to be arising from the GPE. GPE has never made funds available directly to civil society organizations until now through this Knowledge Innovation and Exchange Fund and the Advocacy and Social Accountability Fund. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those funds are for. And then I'm going to hand it over to the network leads, to Mel and to Helen and Nicole, although I don't think Nicole is here, to talk about how we're going to, or to suggest and welcome ideas on how we're going to coordinate amongst ourselves in terms of putting forward proposal recommendations. Can I ask Veronica to go to the next slide, please?
Yeah, and Yona, actually, can I just explain very quickly? Nicole isn't on the call because she's based in Australia and it's currently midnight there, so she'll be joining the second call. And could I also ask if everybody could just quickly write their full names where they haven't got their full names into the chat box and which country they work from if they haven't done that into the chat box, so we have an idea of who's on the call. If that be possible. And also just to explain, as Veronica has just said, that we will be tracking any questions that you write in the chat box. So if you have any question, write it in the chat box, and we'll be pausing at different points to take your questions, both with you talking to us as well as what you've posted in the chat box. Sorry to repeat that, Yona, and sorry to interrupt you. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's great. And yeah, just one more thing to mention is that the GPE is highly, highly technical. So what we're presenting here today is kind of the basics. If you want us to go into any more depth, please let us know, and I can I can arrange a call with you bilaterally, or we can spend some more time going into the issues that that you're most interested in. So I think most of you would already know what the Global Partnership for Education is. It's the largest multi-stakeholder partnership in the world that funds education. It brings together a wide spectrum of stakeholders, so governments, multilateral agencies, international organizations, foundations, the private sector, civil society, all come together to mobilize resources towards areas of greatest need in the education sector, which also includes pre-primary education. Currently, there are 74 developing country partners. These are countries that receive GPE grants. And a quick scan yesterday shows that that plan has presence in 38 out of the 74 developing country partners that are members of the GPE. GPE really exercises a unique approach that strengthens national systems. So it's about systems building. It's about building the capacity of ministries of education and governments to deliver on the right to education in their country. And it attempts to focus on the most urgent issues. So they have a very large portfolio of countries that are fragile and conflict affected. Girls' education is a strategic priority for them, as well as learning and improving teacher effectiveness. And since the inception of the GPE, it has committed over $5 billion to support basic education. So it's one of the largest donors in the sector. Next slide, please. So here's just a graphic that kind of shows you, how the GPE functions at a country level and a global level. Really, the education sector plan is the heartbeat of the GPE. Without the sector plan, countries cannot apply for GPE grants. So a prerequisite of applying for a GPE grant would be to have a sound education sector plan that's based on evidence and has been developed by the local education group, which is a group in country. Sometimes it's called the local education group. Sometimes it's called the development partners education group. But it should include civil society. That's one of the prerequisites, that the ESP development process includes civil society. And like I said, the ESP or the education sector plan is a prerequisite for GPE funding. Everything kind of hinges on the strength and validity of that ESP. Countries normally have an indicative allocation, so GPE uses a formula to say this country could apply for X amount of dollars. This is based on need, and there is 30% of that indicative allocation is what's called a variable tranche. So it is allocated based on application strength around a particular issue, equity, efficiency, or learning. So in terms of advocating for gender equality in education and girls' education, we often work with country offices to push their governments to apply for that 30% variable tranche, or to make governments aware that they can, get more money if they create an application that is looking at equity issues, for example. Next slide, please. So just in a nutshell, GPE governance, like I said, ministries of education are the ultimate recipients of GPE grants. And there is a grant, what's called a grant agent in country. The grant agent is selected by the local education group, so those are the partners on the ground, to be the fiduciary overseer of the funds. Normally grant agents are bilateral or multilateral agencies, and in many, many cases it is the World Bank that is the grant agent. But there are cases where civil society is also able to be a grant agent up to a certain amount. So for example, Save the Children has been the grant agent in Bhutan and Somaliland. The board of directors includes 20 constituencies, so it's quite a large board that represents all the different stakeholders that are involved in the GPE. And there's a little bit more on the board of directors composition on the next slide. And then lastly, there's the Secretariat, which has grown quite large in recent years, and the GP Secretariat helps to support the board and board committees, do advocacy work, and manage relationships, and above all, their function is to support the developing country partners through what's called the country support team at the GP Secretariat. Next slide, please. So this is the board composition. You can see that there are 6 developing country partner constituencies, 6 donor country partner constituencies. Civil society has 3 constituencies. I'll get into that in a minute. The private sector and foundations have 2 constituencies, and multilateral agencies have 3 constituencies. So for civil society, there is a constituency for the Northern Civil Society, there is a constituency for Southern Civil Society, and there's a constituency for teachers' unions. And I'm very happy to say that Plan International was recently elected to be on the board of the GP under the CSO1 or Northern Coalition's constituency. Next slide, please. Okay, so these 2 slides that are coming up here are just an overview of how Plan has engaged with the GPE. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the GPE is probably our most valuable or largest strategic partner in the education sector. We have been a very active member of the CSO1 board constituency since 2011, and like I said, we've been recently elected to the board as an alternate member. We have contributed extensively to GPE's strategic planning, especially their gender equality policy and strategy. We were part of the drafting committee of that gender equality policy and strategy, and now we're actively supporting the GPE to implement that policy and strategy. One of the main ways that we're supporting the GPE to do that is through the rollout of Gender Responsive Education Sector Planning Initiative, or GREST. This is an initiative that we're doing together with the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, the GPE, and several other partners to support ministries of education and local education groups to ensure that when they are doing their sector plan, that it takes gender into consideration and that the plans are gender responsive. And we have some good practices, in Tanzania, Central African Republic as well. This week actually is Plan Central African Republic is hosting a national GREST workshop. So Plan is seen as a leader in this space. And lastly, at a global level, we're about to sign a memorandum of understanding with the GPE Secretariat to support the advancement of gender equality through the partnership. And this will be the first time that GPE actually signs a memorandum of understanding with a civil society organization to strengthen its own technical capacity in any given area. So that's quite exciting for us. Next slide, please. So at a country level, as I said, Plan has presence in over 38 GPE developing country partners, and many COs, in fact, most COs that I speak to are strategically engaged with their local education group who develop the education sector plans and also develop the GPE grant applications. There's obviously varying levels of engagement, but many COs have placed themselves quite strategically within these national planning and policy dialogue spaces. And it'd be very interesting to hear from some of those on the call how you engage with the local education group and GPE mechanisms in the country. As an example, Plan Tanzania hosted the first ever GRESP regional workshop, so the Gender Responsive Education Sector Planning Regional Workshop, with the support of Plan Canada in 2016. And since then, 7 COs in Risa and Waro joined their official national delegations to attend GRESP workshops and are building capacity in follow-up activities with their ministries of education. So it is a really good opportunity to influence national plans and policies, and we're seeing a lot of country offices engaging, especially under the new program and influencing approach that we have at Plan International. So I'll pause here for questions. This is the section of the presentation on kind of what GPE is and how it functions, and after this we're going to move into more detail on the KIX and ASA opportunities. Any questions about how GPE functions, how Plan engages with the GPE?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please either raise your hand. So I think Veronica showed us it's the button with a little hand on it underneath your name, or just write them into the chat. So far we've only had one question in the chat, but that actually is more relevant for the next section, so we'll share that later. Do go ahead, Malawi, Catherine and Maggie.
Sorry, Mom, are there any questions?
Hi.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering, because Malawi, I don't think is very engaged at country level. I just wanted to know, how strong the links were between what's going on at country level and global level. And if we wanted to get more involved at a country level, how maybe UNA or other people who are involved at a global level could support us to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one of the things that we strive for through our, overall partnership with the GPE is to say that because Plan has presence in so many places, that we try to bring kind of the country voice to global level discussions. And I'd be very happy to work with Plan Malawi to kind of assess the context with you and think about how you can best position yourself within some of the policy and planning discussions. It's quite context specific. For example, I know it was very challenging for Plan Ethiopia to engage in this process because of the political context at the time. So it's really country dependent, and it would be great to just have a conversation with you to figure out how we can best insert Plan Malawi into this process.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, so please follow up with me bilaterally after the presentation, and we can work together.
Okay, I will do. Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing some more questions come in here. Do COs mentioned receive funds from the GPE for certain projects, or is this working differently than other funding sources? So GPE does not give, the GPE grant goes directly to the Ministry of Education through the grant agent. So in some instances, Plan has applied for, Plan in country, so this is like an in-country funding opportunity, has applied for GPE grants through the grant agent, whether that's the World Bank, which has proven to be quite difficult in the past, or UNICEF. I can give you an example. In Guinea, This was probably back in 2009, I want to say. So there's a recent example of this. But in 2009, UNICEF was the grant agent, and UNICEF contracted Plan Guinea to do community-led school construction. That was a $7 million grant. So it is possible to apply for GPE funds in country through the grant agent if the grant agent is outsourcing some of the granting work, which in most cases it does. But as many of you who are business development people would know, applying for a grant through the World Bank, which in most instances is the grant agent, can be quite challenging. And World Bank is not set up to make grants to civil society organizations. At least that's not been our experience in the past. I see from IQE, do they consider funding for regional level work like network support? We'll get into that. That's part of what ASA and KIX aims to do. So maybe we should move on. Is that okay? Okay. So yes, there are two funds that are going to be launched imminently. We're not quite sure when, but I would imagine that it will be kind of in the summer months, and I will follow up with the GP to get exact kind of dates. But the Advocacy and Social Accountability Fund is really exciting. It's a fund to support civil society with a real focus on funding coalitions, networks, movements, and what I'm calling unusual suspects. This is a successor fund, or this is an evolution from what was called the Civil Society Education Fund, which ran since 2011 and funded the Global Campaign for Education and education coalitions exclusively. So in many of your, if you're in a CO in many of your countries, you have a national education coalition, and those are the coalitions that benefited from this Civil Society Education Fund. GPE came to the realization that it's not only the national coalitions that are able to advocate and hold governments to account, and that they needed to diversify how they funded civil society and which civil society they fund. So that's how the Advocacy and Social Accountability Fund was developed, and it does seek to cast a wider net, recognizing that other CSO actors beyond the Global Campaign for Education can serve to advocate on education issues. Next slide, please. So this is how the Advocacy and Social Accountability Fund is structured. It's really about enhancing civil society's capacity to influence policy, to influence budgets, to mobilize actors, and to build coalitions both in country and transnationally. So what you're seeing here, the operational component 1 is really reserved for the Global Campaign for Education and for national coalitions. So this is part of ASA is a successor fund, and under OC1, that is really reserved to continue the CSCF funding that the coalitions have been receiving for many years. What's new is OC2 and OC3. So OC2 is really reserved for in-country initiatives and non-traditional actors. So thinking about youth groups or women's organizations or even coalitions, for example, working on child marriage in a country, in a respective country, who are not necessarily education advocates, but are doing work towards advancing education and working on issues of education. So if we take for the example of a coalition working on child marriage, I don't know, I'm just pulling this out of the hat here, a coalition working on child marriage in Bangladesh. They're not necessarily an education advocacy coalition, but through their work they are advocating on the importance of education in preventing early and forced marriage. So GPE really wants to recognize that there are other actors out there that are able to advocate and advance issues related to education. So that's what OC2 is reserved for, and these are going to be smaller grants. These are going to be grants under $100,000. And GPE really wants to have a lot of diversity So they're imagining that under ASA, there are probably going to be 80 grants, right? Some of them are going to be under OC1, a lot of them are going to be under OC2, and some of them are going to be under OC3. And so OC3 is quite interesting as well because it is reserved for global and transnational initiatives. And in the next slide, I'll explain that Global Hub is already working, it has been working to establish a new kind of global youth constituency within the Global Campaign for Education, and we're going to help this youth constituency, which is basically a global solidarity network of youth organizations, apply for ASA. So the idea is that Global Hub applies for the funds are for us, but we're going to build the capacity or support these young people to be able to apply for a larger grant. Next slide, please. So this is just again the operational components. What I just talked us through, the OC1, OC2, and OC3. I don't think I have much more to say on that. It's just a little bit more of an elaboration. Next slide, yes, please. And this is just some of PLAN's pre-engagement in ASA. So as I mentioned, the youth activism piece. As you know, our organization, we just launched the Powering the Movement strategy, which really speaks to how PLAN wants to support young people and youth movements in line with Girls Get Equal. And we're thinking about how we can support youth activists in education, build global solidarity, because we know that oftentimes they're doing great work in their respective countries, but they need a platform where they can all connect and build solidarity across regions. So as I said, we're already working with this youth constituency to build their capacity. And there is a potential for PLAN to play a grant agent role, but that's not our ultimate goal. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that these young people, are able to access this fund. We're also exploring partnering with UNGAI, with the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, to be the ASA gender learning partner. So part of ASA is to identify these learning partners on certain thematics that can help build capacity across all the grantees that are going to receive the ASA funding. So we are already doing this. In many contexts, we are providing our gender expertise to civil society partners that we work with or coalitions that we work with. This way, it will just be made more official, and potentially we can get some funding to do that. Next slide, please. Potential opportunities to engage in ASA. So it's important for us to mention that ASA will not fund INGO's own advocacy work. So, if you're thinking that this could potentially fund, your own, campaign or advocacy initiative, it's not going to be for that. However, it could fund coalitions, networks, and partnerships that PLAN belongs to at a country level or a regional level for advocacy and social accountability initiatives. So, for example, and this is just me pulling things out of the hat again, RNEC, which is the Asia Regional Network on Early Childhood, PLAN is a very active member of that network and could work with the network to apply for ASA funds. Or if you have a girls' education working group in a respective country, or for example, a coalition that's working to end early and forced marriage, you could potentially apply under CO2. The last thing I'll say on ASA is that, and Mel and Helen will get into this a little bit more in KIX, we really want to make sure that we're very tightly coordinated on any applications that are going in, because we need to manage PLAN International's overall strategic relationship with the GPE. So any ideas that you may have on applying for ASA, please share them with me so that I can have kind of an overall view of where the interests lie, and try to support you with your ideas and with your applications. Next slide, please. Or I don't know if we want to pause here and have any questions about ASA. What do you think, Mel?
I think Catherine has raised the hand.
Okay, so let's stop here and take a few questions about ASA.
I'm not actually sure whether Catherine raised her hand again. Catherine and Maggie, did you raise your hand again? Because it might be
I think it's
before.
fine. Sorry.
Yeah, no problems at all. If you could just lower your hand, that's fine. But if anyone else has any questions, and actually, while you're thinking, I do actually have a question. Do we have any idea of how many years the grants from ASA will cover? Will they be multi-year grants? And will the grants also potentially include core funding for the group, the movement, the coalition, or will it only be for activities around holding the government to account and advocacy?
Yeah, no, I think for sure it'll cover core funds. I think there's a real understanding that civil society needs the core funds in order to do the work. So I think for sure you can build in, administrative costs into your grant application. In terms of the length, I think there's a lot of flexibility. I think that ASA wants to give flexibility. They want to generate innovative initiatives and ideas from civil society. So this certainly could be it will be a multi-year granting opportunity. Any other questions before I move on to the KIX section of the presentation? Okay, let's move on then. KIX, the Knowledge Innovation Exchange Fund. This is again a very exciting funding opportunity from the GPE, and it really aims to look at, where the gaps are in global public goods and education, recognizing that, we need to collectively generate solutions to some of the pressing issues in education. The total funding allocation for this will be $60 million. My understanding is that no grant can be more than $5 million in each bucket, thematic bucket of KIX, which we'll get into in a minute. The grant agent selected for this is the International Development Research Center. It is a research think tank center based in Canada. And I should have mentioned that for ASA, the grant agent is Oxfam IBIS, based in Denmark. So there's just a little overview there for you about, the amount of money and how it's going to be allocated. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm just finding my place here. Yes, so this shows you the 6 thematic areas that KIX will work in. These are some of GPE's strategic priorities, so learning assessment systems, teaching and learning, early childhood education, gender equality, equity and inclusion, and data systems. And GPE actually has engaged us in the early thinking around gender equality and early childhood education. They commission discussion papers or white papers on each one of these thematics to kind of provide an overview of where the gaps might be in these thematic areas. And Plan was consulted on the gender equality paper and also the early childhood education paper. We were handpicked by the GPE, and it was a little bit difficult for us to request to be involved in the consultations in the other areas. But GPE did send us, I believe, the paper on teaching and learning assessment. I'll let Helen speak to that in a minute. Next slide, please. So this just kind of shows you, the purpose or the kind of theory of change behind KIX. They want to define a policy challenge that is central to the realization of their strategic priorities and is central to many of the developing country partners' needs. It will play kind of this clearinghouse function where, it asks the question, do we have promising answers already? If we do, can they be scaled up? Can they be applied to multiple contexts? And if no, commission, some work around developing a potential solution. So it could be, KIX funding can go either to scaling up a project or initiative where there is emerging evidence that it works in one or two contexts, and we want to see whether or not it can be applied to other contexts. Or it can also fund projects or initiatives where we're trying to test a new theory to say, you know, there's a gap here. This is what we think the solution might be. Let's test it out. And basically it's trying to create, you know, a portfolio of global and regional public goods that can support, you know, developing country partners in their policy and planning in education. Next slide, please. Maybe I can move it. Are you guys seeing the next slide? KIX operational components?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So there are two sorry, this is getting really technical, so I won't get too deep into this. There are two operational components. There's the major you know, component, which is the Knowledge and Innovation Fund. Like I said, creating evidence that can be meaningfully inform country-level processes, creating tools, standards, methods, translating knowledge and innovation into education sector planning, policy development, and implementation approaches. And then there's kind of a learning exchange. So they really want to see the connections between KIX and ASA. There's a point in there about brokering with ASA. And, you know, this whole idea of knowledge mobilization. How do we take some of the findings that are being generated through these KIX grants and actually disseminate it or exchange it with partners across the world and across regions? I'm going to stop there. This is the end of my spiel, and I'm going to hand it over. We might want to take a break here and just see if there's any questions about KIX specifically, and then I think Mel and Helen are going to kind of take us through the emerging priorities that we've been seeing in KIX for ECD and some of the other areas.
Okay, so are there any questions on the KIX in general? I can't see any having come through in the chat. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask, please just stick up your hand. This won't be your last chance. We will continue. Okay, so while you're thinking, what I will do is press ahead. I can see Tunsifu writing, but I will press ahead. And as I said, we can swing back and ask both general and specific questions as we go along. So first of all, hello everybody. If you don't know me, my name's Mel Swan. I know that there are people on this call who are probably linked more significantly to the Education Network, and I actually work with in the ECD, the Early Childhood Development Network, together with Nicole Rogers from Australia. So it's great to be on this call and to be having this joint call together with the IQE network. We, as Fiona has just said, we're actually involved in the process of reviewing the white paper on early childhood care and education. We were invited to the table to do this, and several of you who are on this call were actually involved in this process. And like all the white papers, I think what they've tried to do, as Fiona was saying, is identify where there are real needs within the developing country partners to support strengthened, equitable and quality education, including early childhood care and education and formal pre-primary. This reflects the fact that GPE works with most of the developing country partners at this current point in time on basic education extending into pre-primary. And they have identified a number of priorities with the DCPs where the developing country partners feel there's a real need to expand their knowledge and improve their practice to help scale up quality early childhood care and education. And you can see these up on the screen. In particular, workforce strengthening has come through very strongly. not only enhancing the competencies of the workforce through, for instance, teacher training and monitoring, but also how to ensure that the early childhood workforce is retained and kept in place, ensuring adequate teacher incentives and pay. A second priority that came through is how to design and implement an age-appropriate, contextually relevant curriculum based on defined early learning standards. And a third priority area that came through from the countries as a felt need was how to improve data collection, analysis and integration into existing systems, as well as planning. So the whole continuum of planning, monitoring and evaluation within the early childhood care and education sector was an area that was felt to be of priority, including the monitoring of the service quality. So the consultants that actually undertook this white paper did a scan of what global goods actually exist to meet these needs. And when we talk about global goods, we're talking about tools, resources, methods, activities, approaches that can be used, as Fiona has said, to really address the problems that education sectors are facing, the real issues that they're facing, and that have been tested and are applicable, we hope, across multiple contexts. And they really have come up with 5 areas in which they think there are some global goods existing in some cases, but more work needs to be done. And really these are more or less repeats of the above, so I'm not going to go into detail, but it's tools for improved system level planning and resource allocation, and linked to that right down at the bottom, tools for data collection and monitoring of services, particularly related to service quality. Then tools and resources for effective design and implementation of ECCE curricula, including curricula that are aligned with the primary curricula, curricula at the primary level, and including tools to actually assess how effective and relevant these curricula are. Resources for training and supporting the early childhood care and education workforce and for attracting and retaining qualified teachers and staff, and approaches for engaging parents and communities as key strategic partners for early childhood care and education systems and services. Now, as I said, they identified that across most of these, there are potentially global goods already in existence, that these have not necessarily been adequately shared, they've not necessarily been adapted and appropriated within systems in different countries, and there are, in some cases, significant gaps, particularly around the engagement of parents and communities with early childhood care and education systems and services. So they've identified these 5 areas as areas where we need to do more at the global level, thinking about the 3 streams that Yona has suggested, where global goods already exist that we think could be relevant across multiple contexts. How do we improve learning and exchange and sharing about these? Where there are activities, resources, methods in existence that have been tested, but only perhaps in a couple of contexts, how do we test these in other contexts in order to assess whether they could be relevant across a wide variety of low and middle income countries in which the GPE is working, and where we really don't know what we're doing, how could we invest in testing and piloting innovations that could then potentially go on to become global goods. I hope that's clear so far. So they've identified basically what could happen in each of these 5 areas. I do want to stress that when we gave feedback to these 5 areas, the collective perception amongst all the people that actually reviewed the white paper was that there are some big things missing, most notably gender and how to ensure that early childhood care and education systems are gender responsive. Inclusion was also a comment that was made. How can we ensure that these services are inclusive? And also, as part of this, for instance, we're looking at what works in terms of mother tongue, multilingual education. And finally, the issue of transition from pre-primary or from early childhood care and education to primary school was something that we felt the white paper really didn't address at all, and was another area that we believe should be a global priority. I hope that was clear. We're waiting for the new paper to come through, and we hope this will be reflected. But we wanted to present these to you because the suspicion is that once this investment fund is launched, it is quite likely that they will be looking to fund projects in these particular areas. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I'm going to stop there, and I think we're then going to go on to education and take some questions.
Can I just quickly add that we've basically been given a competitive advantage by the GPE on these two thematic buckets, ECE and gender, because we are able to see where they're likely to give funding to. I also want to say that GPE is very keen on seeing unique consortiums, so they will likely give preference to applications that have multiple partners that have unique things to add. So, for example, plan partnering with an academic institution and maybe another a foundation or something that is quite unique where organizations or entities are coming together to leverage their expertise.
Thanks, that's an important point that I forgot to make. Shall we go on and have a look at what we expect the priorities potentially to be in education, reflecting again, as Fiona said, that we do have the competitive advantage because we know upfront what they're likely to be, so we can start to prepare ourselves around these. Over to you, Helen.
The next one is gender. I don't know if you want to talk to that, Fiona, or if you'd like me to go through it.
Yeah, why don't you go through it and I can add anything that's that I think needs to be added.
Yep, great. Okay, so I'm Helen O'Reilly. I'm the Global Lead for Inclusive Quality Education. So welcome to everybody who's joined since the beginning. The potential priorities for gender that were outlined on the white paper were for achieving gender equality in and through education, 3 potential investment areas were identified. And again, in exactly the same way that Mel just mentioned, they have looked to see what global goods are already in existence and being used, and so they have identified areas where they feel there are major gaps. So the first of these 3 is building capacity through knowledge transfer, capacity development, and learning exchange on topics where there is sufficient evidence base. And the examples they gave were the gender responsive education sector planning, child marriage, early pregnancy, and SRGBV. The second potential area is building evidence and evaluation of what works on topics where there are some examples of solutions, but more synthesis is needed to develop a solid evidence base. And the example that they gave there was building evidence on how identities of masculinity are formed and how they can be addressed through education. And the third potential investment area is that of innovation. Innovation on topics where there's a need for new thinking and solutions. And examples given here were the use of IT, documenting good practices, and showcasing successful results. So all in all, we have 6 funding streams, 1 being gender, 1 being early childhood, and then we're left with the other 4 of equity and inclusion, teaching and learning, learning assessment systems, and data systems. And as Fiona mentioned, we were lucky enough to see the white papers for early childhood education and gender equality and be able to give some feedback. We have managed to see some information on equity and inclusion and teaching and learning, but haven't seen any further information on learning assessments and data systems. So to give a little bit more information on equity and inclusion, the focus here is primarily on strengthening education data, planning and evidence within the GCE countries. So the areas that have been identified as potential priorities, again, they've looked at the global goods that exist and they've looked at the major gaps. The areas identified are collecting data on invisible groups, using disaggregated data more effectively, systematically including equity in education planning, identifying approaches for groups requiring targeted support, strengthening equitable accountability systems, and developing approaches to domestic and aid financing for progressive universalism. So some of those there would certainly be of key interest to many planned programs, I think, and are areas where certainly we would like to see our programs strengthened. For teaching and learning, the three areas of potential focus are the effective sharing of evidence and good practices related to implementing teacher standards and professional development policies, system-level approaches to aligning teaching curriculum and learning materials, and support for effective teacher management and engagement. And again, some of those issues that are ones that planned programs are already involved in to a greater or lesser extent. I don't know if anybody has any questions about what Mel and I have just explained about the 6 streams. If anybody has, please can you let us know.
Helen, maybe I can just make one point here, is that whatever plan decides to, if and how and when plan decides to submit on ASA or KIX, all of the applications need to speak to one another. They cannot be, GP is looking for the interconnectedness. So, you know, although applications might address a specific issue, there needs to be a connection, or they need to be speaking to one another. I think that would be very important, and also it is a competitive advantage of plan and the way that we are proposing to coordinate on this opportunity, which I know that you're going to be getting into now.
Thank you for that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about the proposed process for submitting proposals to KIX. Obviously, at the moment, we don't have the full information, which we won't have until probably the middle of the year. We don't have, as Jana said, we don't have any definite dates yet. Until we have that full information, obviously offices are not going to really have a clear idea necessarily of exactly what they would propose doing and who they might be able to work in partnership with. But obviously working as an organisation like Plan, we don't want to get into the situation where we have lots of different offices competing against each other potentially on proposals which might, for example, overlap. So we want to be able to help offices to coordinate and to work together where appropriate. So let's go through this slide. We're saying in order to avoid internal competition. Oh, Wilson, you've got a question. Would you like to ask your question before I go any further?
Can you hear me from over there?
Go ahead, Wilson.
Yes, can you hear me from over there? Okay, I am like from Nigeria here. I know we just pioneered or piloted the early childhood development education, and one challenge we've been having is sustainability. We had through the Nigerian Humanitarian Fund, we got just a 1-year intervention, and through the MFA Finland, we got a short-term intervention of 8 months. But as it is, the impact, which we can't say we can measure a long-term impact, but we've seen good results for why this should be continued. So could this be a forum for where we could put in proposals for ECD too?
Can I respond to that, Helen?
Yes, please, Fiona.
Yeah. Obviously, I mean, yes. I mean, we can consider it. You know, we'd have to look at, you know, the details. But I want to reiterate that GPE is looking for quote unquote solutions that can be applicable across multiple contexts. Nigeria might be a special case because it's such a large country and it has federated states that receive separate funding. You know, the 3 different states in Nigeria receive their own GPE grants, so we might be able to consider something that's just Nigeria specific, but I think we need to potentially position it as, you know, a solution that can be applied across, you know, the Lake Chad region, for example, right? So it's going to be being applied to multiple countries. Those are the kind of solutions that they want to invest in the most, where they're going to be able to use the solution or the result across multiple contexts.
And Yona, just to confirm, that would mean that we would probably, because as we said, there are really sort of 3 streams that they're looking at. One is where the global good exists to build more learning around it. The other is where there's a potential solution that hasn't been broadly tested to actually support that testing in other contexts. And the third is piloting something new when we really don't have a solution so far. And from what I understand, we would potentially be looking at those second 2, where we think we have a solution that might be relevant in additional contexts. How could we actually test it in new contexts to see whether it could represent a global good, or whether we think there's a total gap. When we think there's a total gap, how could we develop and test something innovative and new? Is that correct?
That's okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Yes, that's right. And so you know, it can't be a traditional program design because there is this you know, the emphasis is on the learning, right? Is on the kind of, you know, how are you going to extrapolate you know, the learnings from this program and apply them more widely. So your kind of, if you will, your M&E system or your learning system is going to have to be really the primary focus of the design. And I'll also say that, like I said, they're looking for partnerships and consortiums. So an application where it's just plan working in one country might not be as attractive as, you know, partnering with others and you know, applying it to multiple contexts in the region. So if we're talking about ECCD and emergencies in Nigeria, you know, looking at how it might apply to other countries affected by the Lake Chad crisis or similar crises. Does that help, Wilson?
While Wilson's writing, Helen, shall we go back to the proposed process? Do you want to continue with that? Great.
We're not hearing anything, Helen. I don't know if you're speaking.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so what we're proposing that in order to avoid internal competition and to maximize the probability of success, that the ECD and IQE networks would coordinate and support the process of applying for funding. And within this, we have to all bear in mind that the Global Hub manages the technical relationship with GPE. So Yona is our main link, is our key focal person for GPE, so everything really needs to go through her. So we really need to emphasize that no individuals or individual offices should be contacting GPE independently. That at any point in this process, people would contact the networks or Jonna directly, depending on what the question was, in order to get clarification and move forward. So
okay.
what we
I just want to say that I'm not the gatekeeper. I don't want people to think that. It's really what I think what Helen is trying to say is that it's really the networks that are there to support and coordinate. So if you have an idea, as you move along in the process of trying to develop that idea, please use the network as your support and resource. We're not suggesting that people not apply. It's just that we want to make sure that it's very tightly coordinated, that there isn't any duplication, and that all submissions that might be made through Plan International are going to win. So, recognizing that there's a limited pot of money, how do we make sure that the applications that are going through are the most strategic, speak to, issues and solutions that the GPE really wants to generate, are using a very innovative approach to bringing partners together. These are all the kind of criteria that the networks will help to develop to ensure that any proposal that's going in is really going to be a winning proposal.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, once these papers are released, we will draw up a set of criteria within the networks that we think need to be met, and then we'll be able to draw up an internal timeline for proposal development. As we say, the only timeline we have at the moment for the release of the papers is mid-year. So once we know when they're going to be released, then we will be able to draw up a timeline based on that. So we will be sharing the papers and the criteria within the networks and asking that all country offices and national offices who are interested in submitting a proposal first send an expression of interest to the networks. This would be quite a brief document, probably just a couple of pages, so that we would get an overview of the kind of thing that you were proposing to develop. We would then advise all those COs and NOs of the basic information about the other expression of interest that had been received. And we would do this so that offices would be aware of any overlaps between the proposal that they are intending to draw up and that another office may be intending to draw up, and therefore any potential for collaboration. Also to ensure that offices are not putting lots of time and energy into producing two things which are maybe very similar, where we could actually, with a bit of work, bring something together and make it even better. And the networks will then seek to bring offices together for joint submissions where possible. As Jonna has said, the more innovative, looking in terms of the partnerships that are there, we're not talking about things applicable just at country level. We're looking at things with a far greater impact. So the more we can do to bring people together in really good partnerships, the better. Should there be more than two expressions of interest for any of the funding streams, then the idea is that we would set up an internal committee to select a maximum of 2 proposals to be submitted per funding stream. The idea is that the proposals then submitted would be really top quality and would stand a very good chance of winning, rather than us having lots of proposals that are being submitted in Plan's name which don't have such a good chance. The networks will then support the development of full proposals for submission for KIX funding. So I'd be really grateful if anybody's got any questions about that process, if you could raise them now. Obviously, if you have questions later, you can always raise them later, but anything you can think of immediately.
Helen, sorry, please do one really quick thing.
Yep.
I think, I think we can start thinking of ideas now before the papers are issued, because what I'm seeing in the global sector is that people are already starting to talk to each other, right? Potential partnerships are already forming. People have approached Plan even to say, hey, are you guys doing anything on KICS in this area? Do you think you might want to partner? So there's already a real buzz in the sector. So I wouldn't necessarily wait until you see the papers to start thinking of ideas. I mean, maybe not solidifying them on paper, but thinking of ideas and maybe approaching potential partners to see what they're thinking. That kind of, scoping work can start now, I think.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, once we can get further information from GPE on those other areas that we currently don't have any information on, then as soon as we have that and are able to share it, then we would do that. Again, the same with equity and inclusion and teaching and learning. Once it's appropriate for us to be able to share more information, then we will do. Yeah. One question here that, yes, Jona's answered in writing. The RFP going to be published in 4 to 6 months. Yes, we think mid-year is what we've been told. Mid-year, nothing more concrete than that. And Jona,
do you have a question?
It could be June or July.
I see there's another question here, Helen, from...
Mel, I don't know if there's anything else you'd like
Audrey.
to...
Yeah. Audrey's question is, what's the maximum grant available for any one submission? Should NOs be talking to COs about partnerships, or will COs and NOs be applying separately? Or will those potential partnerships between NOs and COs be coordinated at IH level? All very good questions. In terms of the maximum grant available for any one submission, things are quite, the KICS design is quite fluid. I think they're still trying to nail down, the last details of the design. At one point, my understanding was that the maximum grant available per thematic would be $5 million, but they were interested in diversifying their investments. So, unless it's something super duper with many partners, I don't think $5 million would be the norm. I think you're looking more between around $1 million, $2 million. Remember that, this is not necessarily about, maximum reach where you need a lot of money to reach maximum amount of beneficiaries. It's more about, the learning and, testing out potential solutions. So, yeah, I mean, it's between $1 and $5 million from what I know right now. Should NOs be talking to COs? Yes, I think so. I don't think, I don't think the networks will need to necessarily facilitate those conversations. I think you should definitely go ahead in the normal fashion of how NOs and COs collaborate on granting opportunities. But as Helen said, just keep us abreast of your discussions. I see that we're at time, Helen and Veronica. Should we take just one or two other questions?
Yes, up to Sifo. Question. To Sifo, it's not clear if you're wanting to ask a question. If you are, please press speak at the top to ask your question. No. doesn't look as if there's any question coming through. Has anybody got any further questions at all?
Helen, maybe can I suggest something in terms of next steps? Yeah. So this was a very quick overview of many things. It was quite a dense presentation. Obviously, we could have spent an hour just talking about KIX or ASA or GP in general. Mm-hmm. I would suggest that, you know, the conversation gets taken into the network calls and the network meetings, either on Workplace or wherever you all are connecting, to talk about, you know, your thoughts on the process. Because one of the things I would like to know, and I think Mel and Helen as well, is how do you feel about the proposed process? Is this something that you agree to? Do you have any suggestions on how the process might be run in another way? Really, we want to make the process work for you, and the process is being put into place to ensure that plan can win as many KIX proposals as we can. But I understand that there hasn't been a lot of time here to potentially process what we've been talking about and come up with suggestions. So please do continue the conversation into your network spaces. And we might have, we could potentially think of having a follow-up webinar as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wilson says he has another question.
Okay, thank you
just
for
got time
this
for a quick
opportunity.
question from you. Go ahead.
Like our proposal writing strategy here in the young country office Nigeria, which is just about 4 years old, is that most of the proposals for our education projects are developed by the specialists, and we in support. That of recent, we have somebody dedicated towards proposal development. So I want to ask, how can you support us that as a fallout of this meeting to engage our proposal writer and then our specialists for discussions on this wonderful presentation you've made here? Hello?
Yeah. Sorry, Wilson. That was really broken up, and I couldn't hear properly.
You know, I don't know if you heard. I think Wilson was asking about how we could support the business development specialists and in terms of writing the proposal. I have an idea of how to answer, but I think it would be better to come from you.
Okay, should I respond?
Yes, please go. Please go ahead.
I mean, I think Wilson, in the normal, you know, normally, if my understanding, I did work for an NO for 6.5 years, so I understand how NOs and COs partner, but I would encourage COs and NOs to get together on this opportunity, and for, you know, the CO to be able to potentially benefit from the extra resources and capacity that an NO could provide on a granting opportunity. What I think Global Hub and the networks can provide is guidance and advice on the design. So, you know, the idea that you have, we can discuss it together and think about how it is responding to the needs of KIX, or what KIX is meant to do. But in terms of supporting in the actual you know, grant writing exercise, I think that's where CO and NO collaboration can really be useful.
And can I just add to that, going back to a point that you made before, Jonas, that this isn't a bidding process for sort of traditional project implementation. This is to sort of test interventions that are either new or test them in different contexts. So I think it requires strong input from your technical team and strong input, I would imagine, also from monitoring and evaluation, as well as from people involved in learning. I think, we need to sort of think a little bit differently to it being a traditional project or a bid for a traditional project or program. And I think also, and this is why we want to coordinate as far as possible a process involving more than one office, given that the emphasis is on really developing and testing global goods. So it does, I think, require looking beyond more than one geography, probably in many cases. I don't know if that makes sense. So I'll just say one last thing. So swinging back also to Yona's point, we do have a competitive advantage because we know what's in the papers. We're hoping that there will be, for instance, more reference to gender, to inclusion, to transitions in the early childhood care and education paper. But we know what they're already potentially focusing on. So what we hope to do in the next few months before the call even goes out is to actually begin to discuss within the ECD network, where could we really add value? Where could we do something based on what's already happening in the countries and our experiences and our expertise already? I mean, the family and the community level work, for instance, is one really obvious one where we have a lot of work at this level that we could build on to develop a proposal for GPE KIX. But if gender and inclusion comes in, these are other areas that we could potentially look at, as well as transition to primary, where there are a couple of really great programs underway that we could use as a starting point to develop a global good. I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And I know
actually, I'm sorry, Tumsafu also asked a question for Tanzania.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, the government of Tanzania is receiving the second round of GPE funding. Might that affect Plan Tanzania in relation to this upcoming KIX funding? I would imagine it wouldn't, but Yona, you might have a more informed answer.
And it actually looks like Yona has left the room, but I agree with you. I don't think it's going to make any difference.
No, because they're talking about KIX funding going to countries which are already GPE partners. So I think that the fact that people may already be, already receiving funding, I don't think that will have any bearing.
And there's just one last point, because there are other questions coming through, again from Wilson, about how collaboration with an NO could work. There is not a national organization that is formally the Global Grants Account Manager for the GPE. The technical collaboration is managed by the Global Hub through Yona, but no single national organization, for instance, at this point in time is the Global Account Manager, and therefore has the power to decide who sends in a bid and what the bid is about. We do want to coordinate for all the reasons that Helen suggested, but that does mean that if an NO wants to be part of a bid because they have the technical capacity to support the implementation, then the door is open, and you can find the national organizations that you think can best support you in this regard. I hope that's clear. So we're not closing the door to anybody. We want to build collaboration with different offices contributing so that we have the strongest possible proposals. And I think Yona, before she left, really wants to make it clear that she is not the gatekeeper, and it's open to anyone that can make a contribution, a substantive contribution. I think we've lost half of the participants because we've overrun. Perhaps we should draw to an end. We've even lost Yona. So draw to an end.
Many thanks to everyone who's joined us today. We will be having another webinar on Thursday, and the recording of this will be available for anybody who, for example, wasn't able to join until after the beginning. They will be able to catch up on what was said initially. People could always join again on Thursday. And then following on from that, obviously within the networks, we'll be having an ongoing conversation and support for this process.
Okay, so we will leave it there. Thank you so much for all who joined and for all who are still on and for your patience with us as we sort of stumbled a little bit with the technology, but it was great to have you all along. Thank you for the questions and for the interest. And we look forward to working together. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
And many thanks to Veronica for setting up everything on Blackboard.
Yeah, I'm in
a completely new thing for her.
And we will share the link to the recording as soon as possible with everybody,
yes.
with the two networks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take care all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.